If there was a Hall of Fame, a Cooperstown for movie directors, they'd need more than just a plaque to honor Martin Scorsese. They'd probably need an entire wing to commemorate such classics as Raging Bull, Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, and Goodfellas. In his last film, Kundun, he examined the struggles of Tibet, but now he's back on New York City's mean streets with his latest film, Bringing Out the Dead, and here is the trailer.
Rule number one, don't get involved with patients' daughters, you understand?
Our mission, to save lives. Blast off!
Bringing Out the Dead, I am pleased to have Martin Scorsese here. Welcome back. Great to have you back here.
Thank you.
It's not easy to make this kind of film.
At my age.
At your age.
In this city.
With a pregnant wife.
Yes, it is remarkable. It's remarkable. Yeah. No, we were out the film took 75 nights to shoot.
Yeah.
We stayed on a night schedule, and 45 of those nights, let's say 40 or 50 of those nights were in the streets.
Yeah. Is it easier, tougher, than it used to be?
It's a little tougher than it used to be. I think physically it's tougher. It's just you're out there in the street, and 25 years ago you have the energy to keep moving. I mean, you have a little more energy. At night, there's something that happens if you work too long at night, especially on 54th Street and 11th Avenue.
Like what?
Well, you start to get very depressed around 4 in the morning. It's always 4 in the morning, you know?
Yes.
You're never going to get finished with the film. This picture will never end.
Yeah.
You know, there'll be another ambulance shot to take, you know? And 1/3 of the picture takes place inside the ambulances. So I was usually in the back with the script person, and I do the dispatcher's voice a lot in the picture. And we had a run. We had a run from 42nd Street, from 57th Street down to 42nd, down Broadway or 7th Avenue.
Yeah.
And we'd have to get a whole scene in during that period of time,
right,
because shooting sideways, you'd get lights on in the buildings.
Yeah.
Otherwise, other streets, you might as well be shooting in, you can shoot in Santa Fe. Nobody's going to see anything. You can intercut it any way you want, but you have to see the city as another character. So a lot of light coming from the buildings there. So what had happened is that we would start on 57th Street and 7th or Broadway, go all the way down. The actors are getting heated up in the middle of a scene, and then a red light would occur.
Yeah.
And the police were great. Mayor's office was great, but because of the rig we had, which was a big picture car pulling another picture car with an ambulance on top of it with lights, picture cars around the ambulance, it was like a convoy. Because of that, we couldn't go through red lights, so we had to stop for red light. The actors would have to start all over again. Then we'd have to go back to position number 1, go down 42nd Street to west, go up to 57th on 8th Avenue, come around. Yeah. It was like the Condemned of Altona. Yeah. You know, we're sitting in there just depressed every time, you know. But it was quite a show.
But there is this Scorsese love affair with this city.
Yeah.
You're born here,
Yes.
went to high school here,
yes,
went
yes.
to NYU,
Yes,
to
yeah.
school.
Yeah.
You live here now.
Yeah.
You've Mean Streets, other films,
Yeah.
Raging Bull,
Mm-hmm.
all come out of this place.
That's right. Yeah. Taxi Driver.
Taxi Driver.
Goodfellas, too.
Yeah, Goodfellas, exactly. It goes on and on.
No, this is my place. I mean, I guess I'm provincial in that way of thinking.
Yeah.
Where I grew up on the Lower East Side, it's becoming clearer and clearer to me now as I get older that I came from sort of a small Sicilian village in the midst of Manhattan, you know. And as I said, I never even went to the West Side. I walked the first day for registration at NYU. I just walked west on Houston. And hey, there were artists there, bohemians, you know. It was amazing.
Yeah.
It was a whole other world.
That was really your first introduction to Beyond the Neighborhood.
Exactly, yeah, because the high school I went to, Cardinal Hayes High School,
Right.
which is a wonderful high school, was in the Bronx, but you just get in the subway. You don't see anything.
Yeah.
You stay in the subway 45 minutes, you're there, or in the Grand Concourse, you know. But there's no doubt, I do love the city. I keep saying to myself, too, the lighting. I realize that my introduction to film was through writing and through editing, rather than cinematography, because I looked around over the years. I kept... Michael Powell, the great director, he was able to tell the time by just looking at the sun in the sky.
Right.
And Steven Spielberg is able to tell because it was a wonderful story in Empire of the Sun. He arrived on the set early one morning because I asked him how he got this shot of the last kamikaze getting ready to get in their planes to go and fight and die. And they were silhouetted against the rising sun, a real rising sun. It was amazing. He said, well, I got there early and I saw the mist on the ground, and I knew immediately the sun was going to come up that way. So he got the camera and shot the shot. I said, I'm in New York. If I saw mist on the ground like that, we'd run. Something's on fire.
Yeah, exactly.
So because he grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. It's a different thing. Me, lighting for me is, you know, turn a light on in the hallway, and that's basically, I never really saw, I couldn't tell where the sun was. I couldn't tell from a cloudy day or a bright day because of the nature of the buildings we were in.
Shadows and everything.
Shadows, alleyways, hallways, and then in 1965 there was a city ordinance that every building has to have 2 lights out front.
Right.
And then we started to see the neighborhood a little bit at night. You know, and then they got those new lamps, the street lamps. So then things started to brighten up. But up to that point, I never really understood where to put the lights.
Speaking of writing rather than cinematography, as an instructive and as a beginning for you, you're back with an old partner here.
Yes, Paul Schrader.
Yeah. You called him up and said, what? If I'm going to tell this story, I need you to tell it with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's, he just has an understanding of this type of material. When I read the book, I read The Galleys that Scott Rudin sent me.
Rudin, first of all, when he read this, optioned it, and immediately optioned it with you in mind.
Yes.
You know, being the producer he is.
Yes, and over the years he sent me some remarkable material that I passed on. But this one, I said, this is really interesting. I said, it's a different kind of story. There's no straight narrative. It's episodic because the nature of the job is episodic. But this crisis that this young, well-meaning man is undergoing is something that we all have to stay in touch with, you know. You think of paramedics, you hear the sirens in the city, you know what it's like when you're in a cab, and you know the sirens behind you, the cab's got to move. Of course it doesn't usually, but, you know, it's got to move, and you try not to think about it, but in a funny way, it's like delegating caring, in a way. We delegate caring to the paramedics, we delegate caring to nurses or hospitals, but we can't do that. We have to stay in touch with, I think, these feelings. Yeah, I'm not saying that we should all, you know, run after ambulances, but what I'm saying is that there has to be that line of humanity between us and the city and the people who are suffering in the city. I think so. Yeah. I think so. And that's what's so interesting about these guys. And Schrader understands that.
Why does he understand it? Simply because he's of the city, or?
No, I think for his religious convictions and his upbringing, which actually is Calvinist, which is very different from mine, which is Roman Catholic. I believe that he was not allowed to see films until he was 18 years old. So it's a very, very strict upbringing. And but he has a line. He has a line into suffering and redemption and what it means to forgive yourself.
You too.
That's the idea.
Was Taxi the first thing you worked on?
Yeah.
Taxi, then Raging Bull.
And then Last Temptation of Christ.
And then The Last Temptation of Christ, which was a film you always wanted to make, and you got Ovitz and others to sort of make it happen for you. And then you stopped working together because I think he said there was such big egos.
Yeah, exactly.
In the room.
Yeah, you can't. We couldn't be in the same room together.
Is that right?
Sometimes, but he's more cutting with his remarks that way. He just says something. He's the kind of guy who says something to me, and 2 weeks later I think of an answer. You know, I should have told him that. You know what I mean? I hate that. I'll get him next time.
You called him up. So you called him up this time and said,
"Yeah." I said, "Paul, this you got to read." I said, "You have to read this," and he read it and really responded to it right away because of the nature of what Frank Pierce is going through.
Frank Pierce is a character played by Nick Cage.
By Nick Cage, yeah.
He's an emergency room paramedic.
Paramedic he's going through a battle fatigue, really. Yeah. And he's really wondering, is he making any difference at all? Yeah. That's the thing. He goes in one corner and he saves a drug dealer, right, who's maybe responsible for hundreds of deaths. He goes in another corner and he just happens for some freak accident lose a 12-year-old homeless kid. So he's thinking at this point in his life, is there any pattern to all this? Is there meaning to any of it? Am I making a difference? But what's interesting about Frank, and this is what Paul caught on to, is that he loves the job because he brings people back to life, which makes him feel like God. Yeah. And he's got to learn in this movie that he's not God. Yeah. You see, that's the thing. And that's what we thought was so interesting about it. Because he takes on the suffering of everybody, puts it on his own shoulders, and can't get through it now. At the end, they finally tell him nobody asked you to suffer.
And that's beyond the fact that it was a New York story. That's what turned you on, this whole notion of this kind of emotional struggle with some kind of redemption or some kind of something.
Yeah, because I think, in fact, what almost held me back a little bit was, the fact that it was another New York story, and that how do you shoot an ambulance at night in New York? I mean, I've shot a lot of scenes at night in New York. What different way can I find to do these scenes? But the first night I went out with a real ambulance, though, I figured it out, which was the hallucinatory aspect of it. When you're sitting in the front, the spinners are going, the rock and roll is playing, cabs are attacking you. You know, it's like suddenly you realize you think you see things that are not there.
Yeah.
You know, and if you stay in there long enough, it's quite an experience.
It has an effect on the brain.
Yeah, it has an effect, a hallucinatory effect in the brain.
Yeah.
I think.
Cage, was he an obvious choice for you, or was this the first choice or second choice?
No, it was my first choice, and I love his expressive face and the nature of his acting. He could go as high as Lon Chaney in the 20s, you know, and he could be as introverted too, to the same degree, and his face and his eyes to convey the suffering that this man is undergoing, you know.
See, now here's what's amazing about you, Marty. You just said as high as Lon Chaney, da-da-da-da. Do you know anyone on God's green earth
Who may know Lon Chaney at this point?
No. who has seen as many,
Oh.
analyzed as many, thought more about film than you have? Do you know anybody? And who? I mean, I don't know whether Stephen's like that or not, but
No, he's
forget
not.
scholars. I mean, you can't.
I just, you know, they put me in a movie theater when I was about 4 years old. That was
Just when
it.
you had asthma and all that stuff, yeah.
I mean, it was my sanctuary. That and then the church.
Yeah.
You know, when I was about 7 years old, they put me in a church.
And so you thought about being a priest at some one point, too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So movies, it's either I'm going to be a movie maker or I'm going to be a God maker.
Right, exactly. Or you had, well, the neighborhood I came from, you know, which was filled, and I have to always say this clearly these days because too many films and stories are made about just one aspect of it being Italian-American, which is the organized crime, that there were a lot of very, very decent people there trying to make a family, trying to keep a family together and trying to create a family life. But there was a small element that was organized crime. So in seeing growing up around 8 or 9 years old and seeing the people who get respect, real respect, were the organized crime figures and the priests. So you can either become one or the other, you know, and you know you're not cut out for that one. You don't have the guts to, or any, you know,
right.
that's something wrong about that way. It's not my calling, you know. Yet you're drawn to it, and this is what's interesting about that. You're drawn to it because of the nature of the power that permeates them in a way. And the same with the younger priests, by the way, not the older one. The older ones were more for the older Italian-American community.
Mm-hmm.
The priests I'm talking about are younger priests, 21, 22 years old, who came in and gave us classical music to listen to and gave us a book written by Dwight MacDonald, Memoirs of a Revolutionist. This is all very interesting and opened our minds a little bit. But literally, I mean, I couldn't, you know, I didn't have the real vocation for being a priest.
You
know,
it
didn't work out.
And at some point, you were so madly in love with film, too, that you couldn't resist the lure.
Yeah.
When you think about Goodfellas and the films that you have made, Casino,
yes.
Do you hear from organized crime? I mean, is there some sense of that Marty understands? You know, in the same way that if you are of organized crime, you know that Pileggi understands.
Yes, no, Nick knows, yeah.
He knows.
Nick knows, yeah. Now,
or is that simply more a question of where Nick, how smart he is in understanding of that culture?
Nick knows it, and he knows all the Machiavellian ways. He knows all the details and the struggles for power and why people made a move this way instead of that way.
And it comes out of a journalistic
And it comes out of a journalistic integrity and a pursuit of finding the truth. But there's no doubt, there's one, when they arrested that head of the mafia in Sicily, Renzi,
right.
He had a second in command, and he was quoted in the Italian papers as the only film that had showed accuracy what it was like to be in a life of organized crime was Goodfellas, particularly the scene that Joe Pesci improvised, which is, "Why do you think I'm funny?"
Yeah.
He said, that is exactly what it's about. In a split second, you could die.
Yeah.
You have to be very careful, and it's a dangerous world, you know. That's the one time I heard that there was some sort of a recognition. Response. Yeah.
Let me take a look at this. Be back to this film. Here is Nick Cage and John Goodman, who plays Larry, and they're talking about dinner plans. Here it is, Bringing Out the Dead.
With coffee and whiskey. Lucky you ain't dead with that diet. I got it. Half fried chicken and fries. Let's go.
Now, are you going to find yourself, in terms of people who write about this movie, making the comparisons with Taxi Driver?
Oh, absolutely. I think, well, on the surface, you have the obvious. Even Schrader said it when he read it. He said, Marty, obviously, they're going to say a man driving a vehicle which deals with the public at night in New York, on the West Side.
Yes.
They're going to say, obviously, a return to Taxi Driver. Well, it's not quite. I mean, you know, On the surface, there are those similarities, but past those similarities, it's very, very different. It's a very different film. He's a different character. He's a guy who is constructive, not destructive. Travis, unfortunately, makes that switch from reality to fantasy. He lives out the fantasy. That's a bad thing to do by the end of the film. Whereas here, he's constructive. He wants to make a difference. He's really an idealist.
When are you going to work with Bobby again?
I hope in Gangs of New York, the next picture.
Tell me about that, only because this is another film you have wanted to make for years and years and years.
That came out of the ground, in a way, out of spending so much time at St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, which was built, I think, in 1802, 1812. I'm not sure. But it was the first Catholic cathedral in New York at a time when there was a lot of hostility against Catholics in New York, particularly by the Anglo-Saxon gangs that were stationed down in the lower part of Manhattan called the Five Points. And there were a lot of Anglo-Saxon gangs that felt that they were white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and there was enough people in America. Stop getting off the boats. Right. We don't want any Catholics, don't want any Jews, don't want any blacks, don't want any Italians.
We're full.
We're full here now. And it's really good. We've got it working. And we fought in the Revolution, too. You didn't fight in the Revolution. You see, which is true. This is the way they thought. And they thought that the Catholics were going to be, Irish Catholics particularly, were going to be a direct line to the Vatican. And so there was a lot of danger at that time, and a lot of the city politics was, I'd say most of the city politics was worked out through violence in the streets. In fact, the 19th...
City politics?
Yeah, because Tammany Hall got involved and started using the immigrants, and there was split. There was one man in Tammany Hall who was pro-Native American, not Indians, but Native American, white Anglo-Saxon. And Boss Tweed understood that the more people getting off the boats, and the more he treats them nicely by giving them soup at the dock,
the more he could compete with.
Yeah, more he can compete with the other people and get more votes. Because this is the idea of America. They're never going to stop coming off the boats. That's America. And they fought so badly. In fact, that the more research we're doing, we realize that the 19th century is the most violent century in American history. The Civil War is like a continuation of the Revolution, in a way. And then the film begins in 1846 and ends in 1863 during the draft riots in New York, which were the worst riots in American history.
When were they?
1863.
Yeah.
Well, the problem there was that after Gettysburg, I believe Lincoln needed conscription. He needed to draft people, and he started a draft, and it was announced on 42nd Street. And the only thing is, if you had $300, you didn't have to go. So who had to go?
Could buy you out. Yeah.
Who had to go? The poor people down in the Five Points, and the city was up in arms for about 5 days. The Union troops came in. The film resolves itself around that struggle. In
a sense, that's what's happened in Vietnam in terms of wasn't buying your way out with cash, but you could go to college, and you could get all kinds of deferments.
Exactly.
And some people, because of wealth, you had connections and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that's why so much of the burden of dying in Vietnam was so much of it, not all of it, but a lot of it. Same thing, the idea. Who's left to fight the wars. This has been a long time story, though. You've been intrigued by this for a while. Yeah, because going around, living in the Lower East Side and living in the Mott Street and Elizabeth Street, I saw the buildings were very old, and I began to read the tombstones. I went back to 1810, and I was just fascinated by the old history. And I heard that at one point St. Patrick's Old Cathedral was defended by Catholics in 1844, I believe, against the Know-Nothings, who were a Native American group. And I wondered what the city was like at that time. So over the years, I've been doing research. And myself and Jay Cox began working on a script around 1975. And we've taken it up to about 1993, when we decided to rewrite the whole thing. And now, for the past year, we're actually working on a story, the backdrop of which is that period and is that part of Manhattan at the time. So Jay's the screenwriter on this?
Yeah, Jay and myself, and we're working on it about 9 months now. We have draft 7. We're about to go into draft 8.
Why is it that screenwriting takes so many drafts?
I think in this particular case, we needed to find, it's an ambitious story, an ambitious film.
Weaving so many themes and so many different groups.
Weaving the politics, weaving in the anthropology of the time, too. What these gangs were really like. Pretty much more like, they were actually more aligned with the Anglo-Saxon gangs and Anglo-Saxon tribes. So they had tribal warfare in a way. The Irish Catholics, to a certain extent, had a culture, to a certain extent, had a tribal culture also. So that if you look back at what the Anglo-Saxon tribes were like, the Celts, the gods were gods of war, in a way. So I'm also interested in how civilization breaks down And when it breaks down, it becomes a tribe, and smaller than that, a clan, and smaller than that, a family, the blood unit, you know. And so when everything is taken away, which is what happened downtown, to the extent that it was known around the world, the worst corners. The worst corner in the world was called the Five Points. Even Charles Dickens, when he came here in the 1850s, made a visit to the Five Points and wrote about it in his American Notes. Said it's the worst thing. London can't compare. London is heaven compared to what the Five Points is like.
We have nothing like
nothing like this. And so I'm fascinated by what happens to groups of people stuck in a situation, oppressed politically, economically, and what form do they take? A gang is really, in a sense, like a tribe, and what are their standards? You know, how everything is literally decided through violence, through fighting, and that fighting becomes part of the culture, really part of the culture.
What seems central, I mean, this is a giant simplification, but so much of what it seems to me your work has to do about is individuals or families caught up in some kind of huge conflict, of which at the end there is either redemption or, in fact, death.
Yeah,
you know, they fall off the, you know,
like Casino. Yeah,
like Casino.
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly.
In the end, you know, it's resolved by either death or some coming to.
Yeah. But this is a little tricky. Gangs of New York is tricky because there's a lot of action in it, and it's a pretty traditional story too. A young boy has to avenge the death of his father, etc.
Now, is this Leonardo DiCaprio?
Yeah,
he's in.
He's in it, definitely.
Oh, man, that's...
Yeah. So it's
De
he's
Niro,
great.
DiCaprio.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be very interesting, you know. And, I mean, the thing about it is
no wonder you want to make this.
Yeah, I'm dying to make this picture for years, but because it's more about the history of the city.
Yeah.
And the history of the city being the history of America, really, I think, particularly in the 19th century. And I don't know. I mean, it's difficult because there is so much action in the picture. How does one deal with violence these days in cinema? Especially after making Casino, where at the end of the film, Joe Pesci and his brother are beaten to death with baseball bats by their best friends. And when you do that, there's no place to go, in a sense. It is the dead end of organized crime. It is the dead end of that kind of lifestyle. That's where you wind up. And here, I've got to be careful. I have to think of other ways to infer the violence rather than be blunt about it.
What is it about this thing of filmmaking that turns you on the most? What part of problem solving, what part of it? I mean, you sat as we watched this, and we watched the scene of the, you know, and you said to me, as you said earlier in the conversation, you know, it's hallucinatory because you're here and here and here, and all these lights and things are going on. You got rock music, and you got all kinds of stuff happening, and yet you plotted that out.
Yes.
I said storyboard, you said no. Miniaturization of storyboard.
Miniaturization of storyboards, yeah.
But what is it about this process that, you know, is it the editing? Is it creating the scene? For me,
first of all, you need the story, you need the script to be there. You need the script to be there. You need it to be on the page in terms of the emotion and in terms of something with which the audience can empathize in terms of characters. You need the audience to care about somebody. Okay, that's one thing. So we've been taking over the years, we've been pushing the envelope on that, though, over the years with Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and particularly Raging Bull, and even Goodfellas and Casino. So we're pushing the edge there. How much can you care for a person if he's this bad or she's that bad, you know? Can you still care? There's some out there I know can still care, so that's pretty good. Okay, now let's see if we can push a little more. Now, the only thing for me, though, is that that's one thing. That's got to be on the page. But then for me, it's literally the imagining of shots, one shot being cut to the other, and the emotional and psychological impact of that cut and the movement of that cut. In other words, two shots together, two moving shots together, create another movement altogether in your mind that isn't there. You see, it's almost like dance, like choreography. And that's why this was a tough one to do, because I had 1/3 of the film in the cab of an ambulance. 3 different ambulances, true, but it's an ambulance, you know. Right. And so how many times can you see spinners going, you know, what angles could you get? And I say, well, you know, to a certain extent you would say, listen, just do it simply. But I wanted to recreate that feeling I had driving around with the paramedics in New York at night. I wanted to recreate that hallucinatory feeling, especially of a man who's having somewhat of a breakdown in the picture. You know, he thinks he sees the peripheral vision tricks you in the street at night. You think you see somebody coming at you, there's nobody there. You know, and that's what I wanted to get. So that was like a perfect reason for trying to make this film and put the shots together on paper.
So then you are saying the excitement of it for you, in terms of the ultimate excitement, after you've got a story, is figuring out how you can
visually interpret
this story.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
the key
if you
thing.
had to say that's the highest level of genius that you bring to it. Forget genius, don't argue about it. I mean, that's what it is that your capacity to understand and make that happen.
I think so, but I also feel
Gift,
that...
maybe a better word.
Yeah, I also feel that I have to like the people in the film. I have to love them.
The characters or the actors?
The characters.
Or both?
Both, actually.
Yeah.
Both. First, I start with the characters. And if you have actors who are soulmates too, that's great. That's good. You don't usually... Sometimes you don't get that, but if you're very lucky, if you do...
Well, you get it because you go back to the same actors.
That's one of the reasons I go back.
I want to work with people I love.
Yeah, we all know each other. We know, you know. We'll look that take us and go, okay, let's move on.
Yeah, right.
That sort of thing. But also I have the same philosophy, too. De Niro has a certain philosophy, Keitel.
And it's the same philosophy you have? It's
yes,
a shared philosophy?
Yeah, it is.
Which is?
Well, dealing with the subject matter, that we see it a certain way. And there's a certain truth that we try to get to. Joe Pesci, too, has that about a Raging Bull or about a Goodfellas or a Casino, that we just sense when something isn't quite right. We know that gesture is wrong. You know, you can't direct it. They have to be it. A guy like Pesci is it. Keitel, to a certain extent, different. Although he's in the wonderful range of like The Piano and The Bad Lieutenant, stuff like this. He's amazing. And De Niro and myself, just one of those things. We seem to be drawn to the same subject matter, the same type of character, with very little articulation, verbal articulation about why, you know. And in a way, we just look at each other sometimes, and it's like, yeah, I know, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You know what happens when that kind of thing happens? You know what the next move is. I said, yeah, well, all right. So we better not. That escalates everything. I said, no, that escalates everything. You can't do that to the person. You try to balance it out, but I think there's no doubt. I think we're interested in people who are flawed, people like ourselves. And to see if anybody else cares about them.
Yeah. But also people have some passion.
Yes, yeah. Very much
They
so.
have some sense of wanting to do something with life.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Are you surprised that De Niro has this entrepreneurial flair?
No, I think he loves people. And I think he loves to, he loves a lot of activity around him. And be part of that activity. Yeah. Whether it's working in the office area, or it's the restaurant, or whatever. You know, it's apparently they're not going to be able to build that
in Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
Yeah, we don't know why it didn't work out. The mayor is saying, you know, Miramax is a factor and all this other stuff.
New York needs a good studio.
Well, that would be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, to take advantage and have that kind of complex in.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know what the people who evidently may or may not get it, who they may or may not have lost out to, but I mean, the idea of using the boroughs of Manhattan.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
As the rising of this a whole new community in place for making movies, because of all the people like you and De Niro that are part of the Sidney Lumet and that are part of this community.
Yeah.
You know, let me just do one more thing here. This is a scene in which we've been talking about the idea of what happens to characters. Cage, who plays a character, Frank, is upset, losing his mind and upset over the types of victims he has treated that night. Here it is.
Why is everything a cardiac arrest? What happened to chest pain, difficulty breathing, fractured hands? Yeah, come on, people!
Let me just take you to a very different place. You were in Venice for the festival. You've been doing that for some. You were doing this series.
Yes, documentary. We're beginning.
Yeah, you're beginning. It's called La Dolce Cinema?
Il Dolce Cinema, yeah.
And we know, tell me about it.
Well, over the past 14 years or 15 years, my associate Raphael Donato and myself would travel around the world, and we'd always be talking about Italian cinema and my connection with Italian cinema and Italian movies. And it's kind of complicated, but bottom line is that I began to realize that, yes, I may have been parked in a movie theater where my brother or my mother and father may have taken me to a movie theater a lot of the times in the late 40s, all through the 50s. But that was a certain kind of film. That was the Hollywood cinema, which I adore. And I thought I wanted to be like a Hollywood director, which I guess I am, but not quite. It's a different, I don't know what it is. But maybe what happened is this, that around 1948, they started showing, they had television, and my father got a TV set, a 16-inch RCA Victor. It was a big screen for that time. And it was in Corona, Queens, because then we moved back to Elizabeth Street right after that. And my mother's parents were living out there, my grandparents. They spoke Sicilian only, didn't speak English, were not citizens. They had come over as immigrants. Plus a lot of my mother's family were there. And on Friday nights, I believe, they had Italian films for the Italian-American New York community in one of the local stations. And of course, the first night this thing comes on. They my grandparents come over because they didn't have a TV. And everybody sat around the set, and up comes Paisan by Rossellini.
Yeah.
And the first episode is about Sicily. And I began to notice that the people in the movie are talking just like my grandparents.
Yeah.
And then I began to see, as the picture develops, especially the Neapolitan episode where the kid buys the black soldier on the black market, which is an extraordinary sequence, I began to see them start to cry and say to myself, well, you know, 5 years old. And these things, they're movies. These are movies. They're not documentaries, but they're so real that they seem to be happening as it's being photographed, as opposed to the Hollywood films, which is not to put down the Hollywood film, is something else. Then there was another film, Open City, and then another one called Bicycle Thief, which was extraordinary. The relationship between the father and son is amazing. And so it struck me that, to a certain extent, that, you know, part of me is there, not here in America. And I think over the years, if I've had to make a choice between two types of pictures, I always tend to go to make a film more in that direction, because maybe the impact of those movies, those grainy black and white 16mm prints they were showing, scratched up with commercials in them, maybe that's what really struck me, the empathy for the people. And later on, seeing a film like Umberto D., which is on tonight, I think, at 4 in the morning on Turner Classic Movies.
And what's amazing about that is you know that.
Yeah, I check each day, see what's in, just in case.
You check every day to see what's...
Just in case.
Yeah.
You know, you never some obscure B thing that you, one night, a year from now, you want to see.
And will you record this, or will you watch it?
Record them, yes.
Record them?
I have a big library of Laserdiscs, videos, and DVDs now. DVDs, yeah. So what's happened is that I think we decided to explore how Italian movies influence me. So I do my relationship to Italian films from 1948 to 1970 when I started directing. I stopped there. So of course, we're talking about the great period. We're talking about De Sica, Rossellini, Fellini, Visconti, Pasolini, and that whole group, Francesco Rossi. It's just amazing movies that struck me right around the time, too, that I started making films at NYU. So Divorce Italian Style by Pietro Germi, which we looked at again, is a masterpiece. You know, it's an extraordinary movie. And also, a little further than that, by the end of the piece, we're going to discuss just the films made in Sicily that kind of ties me to Sicily, because I'm Sicilian on both sides. And there's something very special about Sicily and the land of Sicily. I was there 9 years ago. My parents, we visited some relatives there. And there's roots there. I don't know. I'm trying to explore it and do a sort of homage to it in a way. The last 3 films we talk about are Divorce Italian Style, Salvatore Giuliano, and we end with The Leopard, Visconti's The Leopard, about Sicily. You know, so that's it'll probably be about 3 episodes of 2 hours each. The first 2 hours we showed in Venice, the closing night of Venice. Mediaset has given us the money to make this, which is really good.
Is this going to appear on is this going to be part of a feature release, or is it going to be on television?
Part of it will be a feature release, and then the rest will be on television. And my documentary on American cinema will be on television on Turner Classic Movies starting in January, finally.
Wow.
I don't know what happened.
You mean you've been doing it for a while, and now it's going to be on the air?
It'll be on the air, yeah.
Yeah. It's always great to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. Much success with this. It opens... Bringing Out the Dead opens on October 22nd. Nick Cage, John Goodman, Patricia Arquette, and others. We should do this more often.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. We'll be right back. Stay with us.